Hello, 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 everyone. Another great day here in Edison, New Jersey. Another great day for a new thing. I'm so excited to be here with all of you this morning as we continue our series on the difficult words of Jesus and what this means for all of us. But actually, today I'm going to focus on people in the ministry. Because I think this is a really good example of, well, one, the internet in its great glory has provided me an example to use, but also a way that we can apply this to clergy, and how that kind of trickles down to everyone else. So first, let's look at our text for today. Our text is going to be Luke. Let me see here. Let me get this going for you guys. Luke 14:25 to the end, basically 35. So I'm going to read that for us. This is a famous passage called The Cost of Being a Disciple, one of my favorite passages. So it says, large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such person cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still long off and ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. Salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. So, great passage here. And I think a really challenging one. This is one of those difficult words that Jesus says, kind of one of those annoying, pesky things that maybe many of us who are teaching or know the Bible or who are reading through this and run into it, maybe we wish he didn't say this. Now, why do we wish he didn't say this? I'm not saying I did, because I think when you understand it, you realize how beautiful this is. But it's verse 26, right? If anyone comes to me and does not hate father, mother, wife, and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. Now you may ask, like, why not verse 27? Why don't I include that? And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Well, because I think as great as that is, and as difficult as that is to challenge people with, which I love to do, I think we're so far removed from crosses and that being a reality that when you ask someone to carry their cross, they don't even really understand what you're talking about. Even Christians who really understand this passage, right? It's such a foreign thing to us to even have or use that imagery. But I think what's actually more powerful and more challenging for many of us today is verse 26. And it's challenging for us in different ways because this is how we relate to most people in our lives, right? Especially in our world that has become even more isolated due to technology, that our family unit has become even more important for us, or our friends have become more important for us, right? The few, and generally few, interactions with people, like deep interactions that we have with people, are gone that we used to have. And so most people living now generally have their family unit, people outside of that, like, you know, extended family that they may be closer to, and then like a few friends, and that's it for most people who are like millennials and Zoomers and stuff like that. There isn't a ton of relationships that you can have, and I'm sure Gen X is feeling this too, because that's, you know, they're kind of at the tail end of that. But all of this is to say is that we tend to value personal relationships a ton, and people back then did too. The unit, though, of what counted as your family was much bigger back then than it is now, which is worth noting. In any case, Jesus here is saying that you have to hate these people. Now, of course, right, Jesus being schizophrenic here because he tells us to love our neighbors as ourselves, which certainly would extend to our family members. He uses family imagery in his way he talks about the church and the way that he talks about God, and the way that he talks about our relationships, not only with God, but also with each other in parables. Are we supposed to just say that, oh, all these relationships are bad? Is Jesus some like radical communist trying to abolish the family? No, that's not what he's saying. But what he's saying, right, is formed by all these things, because he had a lot of people traveling with him and people following him, right? And he's saying here, you need to understand what following me looks like. It means putting me first everywhere. That's what he's saying. And so he means that this is a big cost to do this, right? You can't just pray the sinner's prayer and then say you're a follower of Jesus, right? You actually have to walk the walk and talk the talk. And that's hard because lots of bad things are going to happen. And so he says, right, you have to count the cost. You have to understand what this could cost you. And so he first says you have to be willing to lose your family and be okay with that. It's essentially what he's saying, right? And that you have to be willing to die. That's what it means to carry your cross, right? To understand that you're going to die if you follow me. And then he uses 2 examples. He talks about, this is like, if you don't think about these things before following Jesus, it's like building a tower and you don't have enough money to finish it, and everyone makes fun of you because you didn't plan well, right? Or you want to go war, or king wants to go to war against someone. He thinks he's going to win. Turns out he shows up to the battlefield and has less, the other guy has double the number of troops, and then he has to send the little guy with the white flag over to say, hey, how will we talk this out? That's kind of embarrassing, right? It's like if you want to fight someone and you show up and they're hulking, and then you have to wimp out after talking a lot of smack, right? That's what's going on. And then he uses the salt as an example, right? He says salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? So just to explain, salt in the ancient world was not as refined. The process wasn't as good back then. So a lot of it would just be lost. The sodium chloride would kind of leak out of it. And so as soon as that happened, it was useless. So it wasn't useful for anything, not even for using it on food. But Jesus points out here, it's not even really useful in the dung pile, right? It's not even useful in the manure pile. And so if you don't count the cost, that's what you're going to be like, right? You're going to be something that ends up being useless because you didn't understand what it was going to mean for you. And of course, like, the first thing we deal with here is we say, well, why? I don't want to give up my family. I love my family so much. Well, Jesus would say, I mean, he does, right? He does say this in other places too, right? But he basically says that you have to be willing to lose them to follow me. And I think that's really challenging for us, right? Because he's not saying you have to lose them. I think this is mostly if you're willing, because lots of families will stand against people who turn to the faith. Not, maybe not in our culture as much, but certainly in lots of places around the world that can happen. And so I think we just need to understand that what Jesus is saying is he needs to always come first, and that the promises of life that he gives, right? It's not in this section, but the promises of life that he gives are good, right? There's the rich young ruler where Jesus says something very similar to this, right? The guy comes up to him. He says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? We'll talk about this soonish, right? And because this is another one of the pesky things Jesus says. But what he gets at with that is he says to him, you have to keep the 10 Commandments and everything like that, where we talked about this last week. And then he says to him, now follow me. And the guy is all sad and he leaves, he goes away. And then Peter says, well, what can we do to get in? And last week we talked about, riches and how do we deal with that. But today I want to talk about what Jesus' response to that is, where he says, truly I tell you, anyone who gives up these things to follow me, because Peter says, we've given up home and family. Jesus says, anyone who gives up these things to follow me will have these things in abundance, right? Brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers, basically saying you get a new family. And so that's the positive and upshot of this, right? That's the good news, is that whatever we lose, God provides for us in the church. right? And for you, you might be like, well, I'm not willing to do that. But I think like you need to take it and use other examples. Like maybe for you, it's your family. But what if someone like the rich young ruler said, I don't want to give up my money to follow Jesus? And your response to that would be, well, you have to. But but he would say, I don't really want to. It's the same thing here, right? Like what Jesus requires us to give up and submit under him is all aspects of our lives, right? If you want to go to school and Jesus says no, right, you have to follow me instead, then you have to give up school. That would have been hard. That'd be hard for me because I love going to school. So I think that we have to understand that everything, the cost of being a disciple is great, but the rewards are even greater. And so all this comes into play for me this week because there's this article that kind of went viral to the tail end of last week, and it's a blog post by this guy named Alexander Wang, who was a pastor, and it's called, the name of the blog is Restorative Faith, and no offense to Alexander Wang, he admits this in another place, but like no one really follows this. This is kind of like his own little place where he would kind of post things, kind of like this YouTube channel, right? For me, it's like I post things to kind of share with you guys and whoever happens to see it, but it would be like one of these videos going viral and getting hundreds of thousands of views, right? It would shock me, and so it shocked him too. But he wrote on his blog why I left the church, and he was a pastor. You can see him here preaching to his congregation. He's the First Presbyterian Church of Arlington Heights, which I believe is in the Chicago diocese. Man, it's like we're Catholics. Chicago Presbytery, which is basically the same thing as diocese, but different because there's no bishop. Anyway, pastor of First Presbyterian Church for Arlington Heights. So he made a decision recently to leave the pastorate. And there's a lot of things, right? He came in as a young guy. I think, like, I don't know if he was as young as me, but a younger guy. He's been at this church for 10 years. So he came in around 2013 and he left in 2023. And he, this is what he says. He gave a sermon and he told them that he was exhausted from writing, memorizing, and preaching sermons week after week for 10 years, which is true. However, there are other reasons why I'm leaving that I didn't have time to discuss, and I want to utilize this article to do a deep dive. So first, he talks about the great pastor resignation, and he talks about how 42% of pastors consider quitting, and then he gives these as the reasons. Now, interestingly, I saw this, and you can see the immense stress of the job. I feel lonely and isolated, current political divisions. I'm unhappy with the effect this role has had on my family. I'm not optimistic about the future of my church. And I was surprised that none of this had to do with money, to be honest. Not because I think that this guy's, or most pastors are materialistic people who want to get paid a lot. I actually think it's just because lots of churches don't pay their pastors a lot. Not saying we do. You guys, we are very fair here. That's the great thing about our denomination. So maybe that's why it's not as a big deal. I'm sure in Chicago he does talk about being paid later, but I think that like generally a lot of pastors don't get paid that much, and so it's actually kind of a good thing. Shows that their hearts are in the right place. Doesn't mean that churches should not be paying them what they need to live off of. Like if your pastor cannot live in the area that your church is located, you're not paying him or her enough. Anyway, so he relates all of these, but he says especially the top two, right? That he has a lot of stress and he feels lonely and isolated, and that's actually really true. I mean, I'm a solo pastor. Most solo pastors are solo pastors. I'm the only one here most of the time, like right now. It's dead in the church, and I'm a really introverted guy, so for me this is not that big of a deal. It's actually kind of nice. It's like I'm in like a cave with air conditioning and heating and a nice comfy chair and lighting, but for a lot of people it can be really isolating. So he goes, I'm not going to read the whole, I'm going to post this article in the thing, the description box below, And I would recommend reading it just to get an idea, right? Um, and he talks about, right, that like he's the thing that was difficult is how enmeshed you are in other people's lives, which is true as being a pastor, right? You really are. You're there for the good times. You're there for the bad times. He talks about here how his church has around 1,000 members. 50% of them attend on a regular basis, and out of those 500, he really only knows 300. And I actually think that this is just normal for humans. Like, this is one of the problems with churches that get pretty big, is that you can't expect a pastoral, like a pastor. I guess he actually isn't a solo pastor. I think he does talk about how he does have other people. But the idea here is, like, how can you expect one guy to really truly know 1,000 people? And you can't. You really only know some. Like, I think that if you've ever been in a business, right, that this is especially a big one, or maybe if you've been in the military, like, you can't expect to know everyone on base. It's just not going to happen. But that's kind of like when you're a pastor, right? You have to care for all of those people, and it's just impossible. So this is more argument for maybe we should cap churches at 300 people, and then as soon as you get beyond that, you plant a new one somewhere in the area so other people can go there too. Anyway, he talks about how hard it is, right, to look people in the eye who maybe you've disagreed with, or maybe you've had, some of the things that they've done, and you always are reminded of that. I can agree. I can sympathize. I'm simpatico with some of these concerns. It is hard. And of course here, this one, 1,000 bosses, right? That a pastor, yeah, like everyone in the congregation is your boss. Obviously you have elders and stuff, but the way that people take things and do things, right? It can feel like they're your boss. The important thing to know is they're not. And I think, like, he talks about here how some people in the community tried to overthrow him. Basically, they were discontent with their leadership. Now, I will say, like, he gives an interview, which we're going to talk about, and I think that maybe some of the things that the congregation was doing was responsible, actually, in regards to what he was teaching them. But I still think that because this made such waves, it's worth kind of thinking about these things in the broader scheme. And of course, in the back of my mind right now, just to show you I haven't left, is the cost of being a disciple, right? So he talks about all these things that are going wrong, and he basically puts a picture of a heretic being burned right here because he's, I guess he's seeing himself as that guy, right? He says, you're not going to be able to please everyone. Some people are going to dislike you. That there are people who like your style, who won't like your style. But he says, it's bad though when there's a whole group of people who want to dismantle your career. And I think he talks about unrealistic expectations. Talks about how you have to get a PCUSA to be in the PCUSA, right? Like, which we are. You have to get a bachelor's to be a pastor. You need to get a bachelor's degree, and you need to get an MDiv. And you have to take exams, and you have to do internships. And when you come out on the other side, the average salary is around $55,000. And then he says it's barely enough to live on. Now, I want to say, when I first came to this church, just for everyone to know, I mean, I don't really care about talking about how much I make. I made $57,000. Which is $2,000 more than that, and I live very fine. Like, I'm not saying I buy Lambos or whatever, but I mean, I might be in a very different situation. Like, for instance, I got a lot of tuition off because of scholarships, and so student loans. And he's living in Chicago, right? The Chicago area, very expensive. It's expensive like New Jersey, but like, I can understand if you have to pay back a ton of student loans of $55,000. That could be a problem. Now, but I don't think that, obviously, the church, what the church should do, and I don't mean just the church at Arlington or whatever, is like the church at large, if we think it's important to ask people to do this, right? If we think it's important that you get a Master's of Divinity, that shouldn't be compensated in terms of high salary. I think instead it should be, because churches can't afford that. Instead, what it should be compensated by is really having some sort of fund for people who go to seminary to pay for it, right? Or to work with seminaries to keep costs as low as possible, because we can't, people can't, after they go to a bachelor's degree and then get an MDiv, with the way the scholarships and things are set up now, it's very expensive. Anyway, he goes on. He says there are 7 areas you're expected to be amazing in. You're expected to be a professional speaker, which he loves. And you can see he's better than me, right? He stands up there without anything, right? Just preaches from the cuff. He memorizes his sermons. I don't memorize my sermons. I have the stand and I read off the paper. And so you are expected to be a good speaker, absolutely. And of course, everyone has their opinions on that. Second required skill is like you're a CEO, right? You have to run the business. And I agree. You have to be a professional fundraiser to go ask people for money, and ask people for money in front of other people. I'll be honest, this isn't as big a part of my job as maybe it was his, but you have to be a human resource director. So yeah, you have to control the people or manage the people that you work for. You guys make that very easy. You're also the master of ceremonies at baptisms, weddings, funerals. And honestly, if he's ultimately responsible for hiring and firing, like there's lots of ways that these types of things could be avoided. But you also have to be the keeper of the Bible and guardian of orthodoxy, meaning that they depend on you to correctly interpret the Bible. This one's actually, like he says, this one's actually really important. This is the most important thing. Because if your interpretation crosses the line into what others deem heretical, you risk members of the church questioning your authority. And that's true. And that is a good thing to worry about. That should be number 1. And lastly, you're supposed to be a pillar of virtue. And I've heard this. I haven't seen this as much from you guys, but I have heard this from many other pastors, that the way that you live in a glass house, basically, and people really kind of look at you as being the moral standard and things like that. And I mean, I think I am seen that way here. Don't get me wrong, but I don't feel an idea of being perfect. And I think that maybe all this could be handled if we take into view, right, all these problems, right, other things he's worried about, if we take into view what Jesus is saying here. Right, so he says you have to be a professional speaker, CEO, counselor, fundraiser, human resource director, master of ceremonies, and pillar of virtue. In all of these things, you have to be good at them, and you only make for $55,000 a year. He talks about the unseen damage, right? All the problems that you have with relationships, the way that can hurt. He talks about how he went to his psychologist, and he talked about how that we have growth mindsets, right? Or versus fixed mindsets. And I thought this part was kind of self-indulgent a little bit, because everyone, I would imagine, if you said, do you care about growing and challenging yourself and getting better? Or do you think you just don't want to get better and don't want to be challenged and live in the dark ages? This is essentially how it's presented, right? Which is a fixed mindset. Everyone's going to say, oh, I have a growth mindset. So he goes, I have a growth mindset, and my congregation had a fixed mindset. I don't think that's true. I think if you ask everyone would say, oh, I have a growth mindset. But it really comes down to, what are you fixed on and what are you willing to grow at, right? I'm sure there are ways that this guy's fixed, and all of us are. But I thought that was funny, right? He says, nothing was off limits. I have no problem dismantling the traditional Christian belief system in service of logic and reason, particularly if it helps us make sense of the world. Whereas most pastors eschew nuance in favor of black and white thinking, I believe we discover God's presence by digging into the complexity of those details. Now, I agree that it's good to have nuance. It's good to dig into the complexity. Not everything can be black and white, nor should it be. Not everything does. But this part right here, I want you guys just to keep in mind, where he says, I have no problem dismantling traditional Christian belief system in service of logic and reason. We're going to return to that in the other article. So he announces his resignation and he leaves. He preaches this thing. He writes a poem. He doesn't know exactly, I think, what he's going to do next. I think he's going to end up being some sort of therapist or like a counselor or something. Anyway, I say all these things because I first think that some of these situations, some of these problems that he's running into here are dealt with by Jesus in this cost of being a disciple. Now, not exclusively, But I want you to take all these problems, right? Money problems, being liked, being a CEO, being perfect, having to be a good speaker, you have to be a good fundraiser, all these problems that he has. And I think it's important to take that and you put it right here. You put it right here where Jesus says that you have to hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters. Yes, even their own wife. Such a person cannot be my disciple. And you put it there, right? You say you have to hate money. You have to hate being well liked. You have to hate being a professional speaker. You have to hate all these things, right? All the ways that we can define ourselves or get pleasure or get pride or whatever from. All the ways that we can do this, right? And that's where you put that, right? And I think that, as we'll see, he did not have that because he lacked understanding of who Christ was. And I'm not saying if you understand who Christ was, you're not going to be burned out, right? The church burns a lot of people out. It burns out pastors. It burns out congregants who are volunteering, right? But one of the things that helps you avoid that is purpose and understanding what you're there to do. You've counted the cost. You understand when you should understand when you go into ministry that, or you go into following Jesus more generally, that you aren't going to, it's not going to be easy. In fact, it's mostly going to be hard and difficult. It's going to be like carrying a cross. But you understand that carrying the cross leads to eternal life, salvation, and it's right, it's true. So that's what you have to do. And I think when you realize that it's a have-to thing versus a choice or a pick-and-choose thing, it becomes much more clear. So I'm not going to read this whole article either, but it talks about how, this religion news service talks about meeting with this guy, and they interview him. They interview other people who agree, who disagree, and things like that. But I wanted to get to here, right, where, so this is, remember, Lang is the guy who wrote it, right? For Lang, things are more complicated. He admits to being a perfectionist, memorizing his sermons, trying to make everything at church run perfectly, trying to help his congregation follow the teachings of Jesus in the modern world. Right? Some of these things can be or should be done away with. I don't know anyone who thinks everything at church can run perfectly. You should just send up hallelujahs when anything happens at all. And that you shouldn't have to be perfect, right? Memorize, if you're a congregation, we're going to get into something that Eugene Peterson has to say after this, which is what we're going to close on, which I'm hoping will be a bolster not only to normal Christians, right, who understand that, who might have deeper understanding for what the role of a pastor should be, but also because you can take that and apply it to your own life and your own relationships with people, but also have understanding that the job, a perfect pastor is not someone who memorizes their sermons. It doesn't matter, right? What matters is that the sermons teach good things, teach the Bible, teach it well, even if it's not maybe the most exciting way of doing it, right? It's worth noting that Paul was not a good preacher. He also says he had doubts about many. This is where it comes into this whole part where he was like, they expect you to teach orthodoxy. He also says he had doubts about many of the traditional teachings of the Christian faith, such as the resurrection of Jesus or the virgin birth, and whether Jesus was the only way to find salvation. He said that he thought by modernizing theology and speaking to people in an engaging, down-to-earth manner, he could help draw people outside the church into the faith. That didn't work the way he hoped. Even those who were interested in his ideas found it hard to connect to a traditional congregation. So, what happened is this is the problem, right? He didn't think that Jesus was this guy who, at the end of the day, was worth following in this way, right? Because he wasn't resurrected. He doesn't say whether or not he was divine. I mean, certainly he probably does not have a normal Orthodox opinion on Jesus's divinity. As soon as you doubt the resurrection, That's pretty bad. Jesus, and I was saying Jesus was not the only way to find salvation. Well, if Jesus is not the only way to find salvation, why bother carrying a cross at all? There are much easier and better ways of I'll be honest, of being religious that don't require as much of you. Like, I don't know, being any sort of pagan, usually pretty good. I'm just saying, like, in terms of what you need to do and not do, right? It's interesting. So you can see that this is the problem. I'm also going to leave this in the comments. So what I wanted to leave us on is I wanted to leave us with this right here, which is from a book called Working the Angles by Eugene Peterson. And I know that, like, this is 1,000,000 degrees smaller, so I'm going to try and, like, make it bigger. This is going to throw all my other readings off, but whatever. So he talks about how the role of a pastor is to do word and sacrament, right? That's how our Book of Order describes it. That's how most Protestant Christians describe the role of a clergy. Your job is to do word and to do sacrament. And so he says, right, like, these things don't really seem like that big of a deal. It's mere words. It's like, just like, what's the difference that a piece of bread or a little bit of wine can make? But he says, right, I'm going to read this. He says, yet century after century, Christians continue to take certain persons in their communities, set them apart, and say, this is a congregation saying this, we want you to be responsible for saying and acting among us what we believe about God and kingdom and gospel. We believe that the Holy Spirit is among us and within us. We believe that God's Spirit continues to hover over the chaos of the world's evil and our sin, shaping a new creation and new creatures. One of the things I like about this is where some pastors can talk about the congregations being very embittered towards them. I think Peterson does a good job in this section of showing how the congregation believes these things. They want you to do it. They want all of this to happen, but they're also not going to do it perfectly, and they're going to put you on a pedestal a little bit in maybe ways that they should not. But he says, we believe that God is not a spectator. Again, this is the congregation speaking. In turn, amused and alarmed at the wreckage of world history, but a participant in it. We believe that everything, especially everything that looks like wreckage, is material that God is using to make a praising life. We believe all this, but we don't see it. We see, like Ezekiel, dismembered skeletons whitened under a pitiless Babylonian sun. We see a lot of bones that once were laughing and dancing children, of adults who once made love and plans, of believers who once brought their doubts and sang their praises in church and sinned. We don't see the dancers or the lovers or the singers. At best, we see only fleeting glimpses of them, the people who have died, right? What we see are bones, dry bones. We see sin and judgment on the sin. We see sin and judgment on the sin. That is what it looks like. It looked that way to Ezekiel. It looks that way to anyone with eyes to see and a brain to think, and it looks that way to us. But we believe something else. We believe in the coming together of these bones into connected, sinewed, muscled human beings who speak and sing and laugh and work and believe and bless their God. We believe that it happened the way Ezekiel preached it, and we believe that it still happens. We believe it happened in Israel and that it happens in the church. We believe that we are part of the happening as we sing our praises, listen believingly to God's word, receive the new life of Christ in the sacraments. We believe that the most significant thing that happens or can happen is that we are no longer dismembered, but are remembered into the resurrection body of Christ. We need help in keeping our beliefs sharp and accurate and intact. We don't trust ourselves. Our emotions seduce us into infidelities. We know that we are launched on a difficult and dangerous act of faith, and that there are strong influences intent on diluting or destroying it. We want you, right, they're speaking to the pastor here, to help us. Be our pastor, a minister of word and sacrament in the middle of this world's life. Minister with word and sacrament to us in all different parts and stages of our lives, in our work and play with our children and our parents, at birth and death, in our celebrations and sorrows, on those days when morning breaks over us in a wash of sunshine, and other days that are all drizzle. This isn't the only task in the life of faith, but it is your task. We will find someone else to do the important and essential tasks. This is yours, word and sacrament. One more thing, we are going to ordain you to this ministry, and we want your vow that you will stick to it. This is not a temporary job assignment, but a way of life that we need lived out in our community. We know that you are launched on the same difficult belief venture in the same dangerous world as we are. We know that your emotions are as fickle as ours, and that your mind can play the same tricks on you as ours. That is why we are going to ordain you and why we are going to exact a vow from you. We know that there are going to be days and months, maybe even years, when we won't feel like we are believing anything and won't want to hear it from you. And we know that there will be days and weeks and maybe even years when you won't feel like saying it. It doesn't matter. Do it. You are ordained to this ministry, vowed to it. There may be times when we come to you as a committee or a delegation and demand that you tell us something else than what we are telling you now. Promise right now that you won't give in to what we demand of you. You are not the minister of our changing desires or our time-conditioned understanding of our needs or our secularized hope for something better. With these vows of ordination, we are lashing you fast to the mast of wood and sacrament so that you will be unable to respond to the siren voices. There are a lot of other things to be done in this wrecked world, and we are going to be doing at least some of them. But if we don't know the basic terms with which we are working, the foundational realities with which we are dealing, God, kingdom, gospel, we are going to end up living a futile fantasy lives. Your task is to keep telling the basic story, representing the presence of the Spirit, insisting on the priority of God, speaking the biblical words of command and promise and invitation. And then he says, that or something very much like that is what I understand the church to say to people whom it ordains to be its pastors. I love that. I think that's great. If I ever work at a if I ever have to do a ordination, I'm gonna read that as part of my sermon, because that is absolutely true. When I read that by Eugene, I'm not a huge Eugene Peterson guy, but that, oh boy, that's great. And I hope you caught some of the important parts of that, right? That the role of the pastor is ultimately to be a guide, to be a vision caster, and to be someone who's a challenger, right? Who is challenging them not based on any of the fickle things of the world, but rather challenging them based on Scripture, reminding people to keep God as the priority in their life. That's where it becomes, right? And I love that sequence of where he talks about how even if we come as a committee and tell you to tell us something different, right? Because that, and I think people need to hear that. And you guys, even if you're not a pastor, right, or you're not being ordained or anything like that, what you should do is you should take that and understand that that's your role to other people, right? Like, it's not as big, it's not as ordained role, right? But when it comes to following Christ, you still feel that. You still have to tell your friends the truth. You still have to be the person who casts a positive vision for people, right? With a life with Christ. You still fulfill these roles, right? You don't do it as a congregation. You're not ordained into it, but that's still your job. And I think that as Christians, right, when we see these difficult words of Jesus, when he tells us to hate our father and mothers, brothers and sister, what he's saying is he's basically saying that, right? He's basically saying in order to do that, you have to love me above everything else, and you have to be willing to stand on that rock despite anything that comes to you. And this is important for pastors, so we understand what's important in the ministry, right? That the ministry is not a place to do social engineering or is community organizing or political whatever, but rather it is a place where people encounter the Lord and they're changed by him. That's what matters. And that's the only thing that matters. Doesn't matter if you're a good speaker, doesn't matter if you're a good CEO. Things could help, but that's not the most important thing, not even close to it. Anyway, that's all I wanted to talk about today. Hope you guys are having a wonderful Thursday. I will see you guys on Sunday for worship, and I hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day. Peace out.